opportunity to introduce Paul Gander, who I'm sure he'll talk about his association with the Camberley District Motor Club, but also to talk on the history of motocross, of which Camberley, I think, can start to say quite prominently that it is the birthplace of motocross.
It is, it's undisputed.
Exactly.
I challenge anyone to stand up and challenge me.
So I shall pass over to Paul.
All right, thank you very much. So, to Gillian's point, Camberley is the birthplace of a huge global sport. And probably until a few months ago, a couple of years ago, everyone had forgotten about this. And it isn't just me enthusiastically saying it because I grew up here. A load of historians have all researched it over the last 30 or 40 years, and they've all come to exactly the same conclusion. The 29th of March, 1924, the world's very first scramble took place, and that led directly to motocross, enduro, and every other form of off-road motorcycle sport that now exists. Off-road motorcycling around the world is a £10 billion a year sport and industry, and it all started right here in Camberley. Camberley, it was the Camberley District Motor Club that had the idea to run it, and they were quite an eccentric bunch, so they were absolutely the right people to put it on. It was run on Camberley land, and it was won by a Camberley man. So to Gillian's point, it cannot be more Camberley. This is where it began. So before I get to 1924, I thought I'd touch on a little bit of the history, because whilst this is a long way back for us, this was recent history for the people of 1924. It was very much in their mind. So the first motorcycle appears in 1885. It's powered by petrol. And at the time, oil companies made petrol and they sold it in chemist shops in little bottles as a wonder cleaning product. And they had no idea it had any other use and what it would do. That's what the very first motorcycle looked like. It did about 5 miles an hour. Just a couple of years later, the first car burst into life, and they were called horseless carriages, because they were seen as sorcery or witchcraft. How could a carriage move without a horse? It was like weird and mysterious. And people were kind of picked out for travelling in these in the early days. So the next thing that happened of note is just down the road from here in Castle Street, where in 1895, the very first person to drive a vehicle on the public road, he'd built this tricycle, it's petrol powered, he pulled out of his yard in Castle Street, and the Surrey police nicked him 1 minute later. Which I think is a fantastic display of impressive policing, isn't it? He's got 1 minute into his first ever journey in a vehicle and he's been done. And they did him for everything they could possibly think of, which was a long list back then, and he got fined 15 shillings. So, and then just a few months later, the world's first speeding case took place, where Mr. Walter Arnold was seen driving furiously, as the police reported, at speeds of up to 8 miles per hour, which in fairness to the police was 4 times over the national limit, which was 2 miles an hour at the time. The policeman, there he is, he set off on his penny farthing. It was a special one, it had 4 little extra wheels to make him safer. And apparently there was a 5-mile high-speed pursuit before he was pulled over, which is something like the Keystone Cops or Charlie Chaplin. But when he went to court, he was originally facing 7 days of hard labour, which in the Victorian terms would have been pretty grim. But he talked himself out of that by he said, 8 miles an hour is not fast. That's how fast a chicken goes. So he used that as part of his defence, and he managed to get away with a £4 fine. But in a court case in a magistrate's court, which must have been reminiscent of a Blackadder film, if you've ever watched Blackadder, he was also fined £1 shilling for not owning a horse. I think it's fantastic. So, on to motorbikes. Right, so the first usable production motorbike, 1897. It's a Verna, the engine sat at the front, and I should point you out some things here. I'm sure you're all interested in motorbikes. So, the engine drives the front wheel. So once the engine's running, you're going, and you can't stop it, okay? It doesn't have like a spark plug. What it had was a flamethrower, which played a flame onto the top of the engine, and it used a fuel that was much more volatile than petrol. So once you were started, you had a flamethrower running here, loads of petrol swishing around here, going up into here, and about 1,000 were made, and most of them burst into flames and killed their owners. There's probably 2 or 3 left in the entire world that still run. In the Victorian era, the press were incredibly conservative and polite and never criticised anything. But a period review, as you can see, described it as an unnecessarily complicated form of suicide, which I think think it's the best review of a motoring thing I've ever heard. It's absolutely fantastic. But to prove that British people weren't put off by the almost inevitable death of riding it 5 minutes, so Captain Arnott set off and did Land's End to John O'Groats on one, which is 880 odd miles. And he managed it in 65 hours of continuous riding, including going through the night. And the roads in that area were rough tracks, think bridleways, and he managed it.
That's ongoing.
Yeah, and for his achievement, either he should have been knighted or probably sectioned. There's two options really for him. So if we jump on to a little bit later, by 1904 things are starting to get a bit more reliable, and the green motorbike was actually made in Camberley in 1904 by Mr. Smith, the local blacksmiths, and that machine still exists and still runs. And hopefully at a motoring event in the summer, we'll bring it along and ride it around Camberley. And you can see it chuffing about. It's owned by, as always with these things, a fantastically eccentric old bloke with an enormous beard, which is essential for these sorts of machines. And if you look at it for a moment, there are loads of levers all over it for controlling all sorts of things. None of it's automatic. And what you see as a syringe is a syringe for pumping oil into the engine as you go along. You've got to remember to put oil in it as you go. And you put more oil in if you're going up a hill, and less if you're going down. But by 1904, 1905, you could buy a motorbike for about £50, which is pretty expensive then, but it would get you about 200 miles a day-ish. You'd probably break down a couple of times, punctures, little problems, but you could get 200 miles in a day. But still, they were only for the wealthy. They weren't for the likes of you and me. And all the roads were dirt. Some cities had cobble streets, which were slick with grease, as they described in period, but slick with grease meant they were covered with thousands of tons of horse muck. It's incredibly slippery on top of cobbles. And the rest of the roads, everything else was dirt. Lights were gas powered. You had a carbide chemical, which is like little rocks, and you crush them up and you put them in a container, and you very carefully had a little adjustable dripper thing, and you dripped water onto them, and that gave off a gas, and that then came through a pipe, and then it came into a wick in your headlight and you lit it. And that was your lighting. And it was pretty effective, but the period advice was have a pipe before you set off, because the likelihood is you wouldn't have enough water on you. So you'd have to stop and pee in your headlights, basically, to top it back up. And if you hadn't had a pint, you'd have to flag someone down and ask if they could pee in your headlight. It's all very bizarre, but quite normal in 1905. No one would have turned an eyebrow over someone peeing in your headlight. Normal. So one of the key drivers for all of this, though, was by about 1904, 1905, machines could do about 40 miles an hour, which is way faster than a horse. And speed itself was the first new sensation for more than 1,000 years. There's been alcohol and drugs and all sorts of that for a long time. But the first time you could travel faster than running or faster than a galloping horse was about 1904, 1905. And people and all the media became addicted to it. It was a big new thing. I bet the first time you rode a bicycle down a hill as a little tot, you got a buzz from doing that. That's still buzz from just going fast. Right, 1911, things are hotting up a bit. Machines are much more reliable now. Ivan Hart Davis demonstrates this by riding Land's End on O'Groats in 29 hours, 12 minutes non-stop. He breaks the national speed limit the entire duration of the country. And he's going to court for this one. He's not getting out of this one. But then it turns out that Ivan Hart Davis is actually one of the descendants of the Duke of St Albans. And no one's ever heard of the Duke of St Albans, but the Duke of St Albans was created when King Charles II had a dalliance with Nell Gwyn. And a little bloke was created until they created a dukedom. So when it came to court, they realised, oh, he's the son of a duke and the son of a king distantly, so they let him off. So good for him. But he did travel the entire length of the country, breaking the speed limit all the way, and that's the last time this was ever officially sanctioned. So motorcycles, still about £50, middle class people can now afford them, people in the insurance industry, people selling stuff to farmers buy motorbikes to travel around, and a motorbike will do about 60 miles an hour. The roads are still dirt, and that picture down there is a typical kind of B road. So if you even hear a complaint about a pothole, you can be very quiet. Thank God that it's not 1911, because you'd have lost the whole front of your car. In a lot of the research I've done, it always refers to the riders fortifying themselves before and during a ride. And for a long time I couldn't work out what that was. But it basically meant they were drinking. They were taking the edge off the pain of riding these old things by drinking quite heavily. So now we frown upon it in drink driving, but back then, completely normal. So Unfortunately, there was no drinking at all at our scramble last weekend. Should have had a beer tent maybe. So, early riders were seen as scorchers. That's a period term. They were speed crazed, they were eccentric and they were adventurous. The roads were still dirt, but people frowned upon motorcycles and cars because they threw up so much dust off the roads as they went along. And that dust wasn't just innocent looking dust, but it was millions of tons of dried horse muck, and people did not appreciate it. I'll show you a short film, hopefully in a moment, if this works. That's me being eccentric and setting a world speed record on a 1911 Triumph. So I continue being eccentric as our forebears were. So 1913, the Camberley Club gets founded. Hooray! Everyone's very excited, everyone's very keen. There's a great camaraderie, everyone getting together and sharing this newfound excitement about riding motorbikes, and they get going. But if you look at the date, it's late in 1913, so they haven't got long to go before the First World War comes and squishes everything and stops everything happening.
And it's at the Victoria Hotel.
Exactly. Their clubhouse, they're gentlemen, the people that ride these motorcycles, they meet in the billiard room of the Victoria Hotel, and that's where they come up with all their plans to get up to adventures and competitions. So the war begins, and this is a big dawning for people riding motorcycles. Many people join up and ride their motorbike straight over to France and start using them in the war straight away, their own bikes. There's no radio communications at the beginning of the war, so dispatch riders, thousands of them swarming all over the back of the battlefield, taking information around is how the generals knew what was going on. It became a really huge thing. There were tens and tens of thousands of dispatch riders working during the war. And this gave normal people the chance to ride motorbikes, whereas before they'd been an expensive mystery and they had no idea how to control them or do anything. Suddenly hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions of people from this country got to ride a motorbike. So that kind of also accelerated the development of bikes because they fell apart pretty quickly when they were abusing hard in a military campaign. And when you're basically, you've got to go bloody fast because someone's shooting at you. So you've got to get to safety as quick as you can, and regardless if you break the bike. So by 1918, bikes have got gears, they've got primitive suspension, and Mr. Arthur Sparks, who we'll come to later, is an RAF pilot. And the RAF favour a brand of motorcycle called a Scott, which we'll come to as well. So 1919, the end of the war, loads of surplus motorcycles spew out onto the market. The average man can buy a motorbike. Social mobility really starts to begin. Before the First World War, all towns are all about 10 miles apart, and the historic reason is that you could basically walk that far, or you could take a horse and cart to market, so that's why all our towns are 10 miles apart. And that limited how far you could travel to work and for meeting wives and girlfriends and all of that. But after that, people had motorbikes and they could travel much more widely. It changed the whole kind of social makeup of the country by being able to travel. They joined into clubs, they missed the camaraderie of the military, and they wanted to challenge each other in competition. And I think it's also a form of therapy. Imagine the horrors of the First World War. You want to get together with your mates, you want to have a bit of a laugh, you want to do something a bit adventurous and exciting, a bit of adrenaline, and so you ride your motorbikes. And that little thing down the bottom, which might be blurry to see, was a motorbike that was for sale in King's Ride, cost more than a stone's throw from here in 1919, and that was bought by a member of the Camberley Club called Mr. Love, who then campaigned it for several years in competitions all over England. So he'd obviously got his gratuity upon leaving the military, and he blew his £38 very wisely. So the club reforms. It's got its most noted citizens in it. So you might think of motorcycling as something scruffy, and you don't want to be a motorcyclist, you want a proper car and stuff like that. But Mr. Over and Mr. Spence and all the notable people of the town were members. There were no social divides, everyone was in it, everyone was all equal, and the club grows very quickly. By 1921, it's the biggest club in the south of England. It's grown massively quickly. And it enters teams in all the big events all around the country. It's known, though, for being very professional, but also slightly eccentric, which I think is good for Camberley. But by 1923, there's a debate raging in the media. Does the north of England produce better bike riders than the south? And we can have that debate now about many things. And so the Camberley Club decided to put on a competition that will sort the men from the boys and answer this once and for all. And this is where we get to the Scramble. So, to begin with, they're going to call it a trial, because that's what these things are generally called. So a trial is, you ride your motorbike from A to B, you try not to fall off, but if you put your foot out to steady yourself, you lose a point. And if you stop, you lose a point. So you can go from A to B, and you can be the fastest, but you won't be the winner. But the Camberley Club decide they're going to put on an event that'll be so hard and difficult, everyone's going to fall off. So we don't want to do that. But the ACU, that's the governing body, says you can't call it a trial, because it's not a trial. So they adjourn to the billiard room in the Victoria Hotel, and they drink, and they have a few more drinks, and they come up with the name Scramble. And so then they come up with that literally the week before the event. It's called a trial right up until a week before, and they call it a scramble. And then they're off. They created the world's first scramble. So, 29th of March, just like a Sunday for our event, the day dawned dry and cold and warmed up in the afternoon. We had an exact recreation of what we had a century ago. The competitors were called optimists, and 80 of them turned up at the Victoria Hotel to sign on, and the period press says man and machine were replenished. So there was petrol in the tank, and I'm sure large brandies for the riders. And then they went from there. I don't know how they got, but they got to Field Lane, which runs down the back of the churchyard still in Frimley, and then Green Lane, which has now vanished, to Tomlin's Coat, which at the time was a big old house. And there they mustered everybody into a group, and then at the hill, if you go round to the back of Tomlin's Coat, there's a hill that runs up the back, which where I used to have near heart attacks running up as a kid. That is where they first touched dirt, and they shot up there, and that was the start of the event a century ago. So, there is some debate about the next bit, and we have a picture of Ian there with a little speech coming out of his mouth. He may ask me difficult questions later. But all the period press says that there were 2 laps. Their laps were identical, and they were 25 miles long. And they set off in the morning, and they all did a lap. And then they had a lunch for 2 hours, because they fancied a good lunch, because they're gentlemen, they wanted to do that. And then in the afternoon, they went off and did another lap. Our best view of the original route is downstairs. It's a little map with all sorts of streaming things showing you what we think. This programme is from 1925, and it shows the names of the hills. Now, 1 or 2 of them, they just kind of rename them and call them little quirky things. But on a period map, we have worked out where all these places are and how far apart they are. And then in period press accounts, it says between one place and another, there was 2 or 3 miles of dirt roads and things like that. So we can work out, it probably was about 25 miles. Keep an eye on Ian to see what raises his hand. But we think they were 25-mile laps, so they did 50 miles, which is quite a feat. Much longer than modern events are. And the winner, which we'll come to, was Mr. Arthur Sparks. And this is Arthur here. The hills were so steep, and if you've ever walked over there, they're pretty steep still. They were so steep that they were too much for most of the bikes. But that was part of the challenge. Only the best bikes and the best riders could get up it. So the guy next to Mr. Sparks is being roped up on what they call the fishing line. So the marshals were given ropes to help the competitors get up. Can you imagine going to an event now where it's so difficult that the marshals are handed ropes to pull the competitors up the hill? That's what it was like back then. There's Mr. Sparks, very competent rider. He's been riding since the war. He's on his Scott. He bought his Scott from White's Garage just a few months before, just up the road on the A30, and he's blasting up the hill on Wild and Woolly. Now, some of these pictures show what the land was like a century ago when it was heath. Now it's covered in trees, but back then it was just heathland. So they went across to Red Road Hill. There's Mr. Budd in what is a kind of iconic pose, lofting his front wheel in the air, just as they do now in all scrambles and motocrosses. And the guy on the left is George Dance. He took part in the event, he came second, but he was considered to be the best rider in the world. And he couldn't beat the Camberley man. Mr. Sparks won.
Yay!
Yay, exactly. So, Devil's Drop. Again, some people managed to ride these hills, others got nowhere near it. And the crowds were in the thousands. So we probably had 1,000 at least on Sunday, so it's comparable numbers. People gather around the most difficult bits to watch it. But what was reported in the press is that the bikes disintegrated under the pressure of being ridden in these kind of conditions. Spectators could follow the course of the trail by the debris falling off the bikes. And half the bikes had then disintegrated out on the course. And at least one of them never came off the course. It's still out there somewhere. Maybe Time Team will find it one day. Right, so, but much of the horrors was interspersed by big flat fast bits, where riders could get up to a reasonable speed. And you can see this down in the bottom corner. This picture I think might be from 1925, but it shows the heath was heathland. And they must have managed it. They must have burned the gorse, they must have cut a load of trees down to keep it looking like that. And it's only after this that the trees have overgrown everywhere. So there were no injuries, miraculously, but St John's Ambulance were in attendance, and the programme said, "They mean well and delight in practice," which is a lovely phrase, isn't it, for someone you hope not to meet. So, anyway, at the end of the racing, Arthur Sparks wins, and he averages almost 25 miles an hour. And the reason I've got Ian there is Ian's pointed out to me that in a modern enduro, so a modern comparable event, the riders never get anywhere near averaging 25 miles an hour. But I'm confident that they did in this event. And I think it's partly due to the fact they'd grown up riding bikes off-road. They'd never ridden on tarmac. Everything was off-road for them. And so that was just normal to them. And there, some of them, it was their local roads, and there were fire tracks, and there's accounts of people doing 35, 50 miles an hour along some of these dirt tracks. So the hills would have been challenging, but they could have blasted down in between them. Maybe they were just better riders back in 1924. So 80 started, 40 disintegrated out on the course, 40 finished. Most of the 40 that finished never made it home on their own wheels. All the competitors used their road bikes to get here. There were no trailers and vans and stuff like that back then. But most of the people that finished had to have the remains of their bikes taken home on a train. It was carnage. And partly because all the bikes were road bikes. The off-road competition bike had not yet been invented. This was the trigger for it. After this, all the manufacturers said, we better build bikes that will survive this, otherwise we look stupid, don't we? Our bikes fell apart. So the results, there's Mr. Sparks up at the top with his cup, proudly sitting on his 486cc Scott motorcycle. There are a few Scots like that still exist. His one has vanished, and that is the cup he won. We have talked to the Sparks family, and the original cup is missing, gone long ago. Maybe it's out there somewhere. Maybe it'll appear in an antique shop one day.
Where did you get the images of him?
That's from an American article we found on the internet. So we did ask the family if there are any kind of better images of him, maybe a decade later, but that's the best image we could get of him. So, but there he is. And as you know, Mr. Sparks went on to found Sparks Garage on the A30 near the Jolly Farmer. So, and his son carried on the tradition. So the picture on the left shows what was going on in 1924. So all the blokes had to gather around all the other blokes and drag them up the hill. But in quite a change, and in 1924, women were seen as damsels in distress. They had to be helped by blokes. Last weekend, we had the damsels dragging the blokes out of the mud. And they were very grateful for being dragged out of the mud as well. So the Camberley Club ran the event for quite a few years. And by 1925, so the following year, they were inviting women to take part, which was quite kind of ahead of their times, really. Women were still very much kind of kept in the background of this area. So to invite them in and let them race was fantastic. And they did very well. they were pretty much compatible with some of the top blokes straight off. But the Camberley Club continued to be eccentric, and these are some of the events. They called them rodeos. And if you look, the crowds are in the thousands. And this was run around somewhere around here, I'm not quite sure where, but somewhere around in the Camberley area. We're not going to run anything like this, as I don't want to try and do the health and safety paperwork and allow something like that to take place. But it was certainly wacky, and certainly the people of Camberley enjoyed it. So in 1926, the event still runs. So the aftermath. So the event was very successful. It got quite a lot of press, but everyone that went to it thought we should run one of those ourselves. So very quickly, within a year, all over the country, scrambles started to spring up. And then this spread really quickly into France and all around the world. So the French called it motorcycle cross country, which inevitably got shortened to motocross, which is what we call it today. But it spawned a whole series of similar sports like enduro and all sorts of other things. And it kicked it off a global industry for riding off-road motorcycles. The tracks got shorter because huge swathes of land were difficult to get hold of. The organisers wanted better spectating, so people could watch a big chunk of it rather than just standing and watching one little bit of it. And inevitably commercial things came into it. They wanted to fence things off and charge people to come and watch it. And so it's changed now over the years. Thank you. But a motocross today still does follow two things from the original. So there are two races or two motos, and that still takes place. If you went to a world championship motocross today, the same would occur, exactly the same as the original. So off-road motorcycles today are the biggest growth market in motorcycling, and everybody makes off-road motorbikes, every manufacturer, including Triumph and all the well-known names. And it all began just up the road from here 100 years ago. So indeed, there it is. That is the start of the Centenary. We've got number one, and on the left we've got Mr. Sparks speeding along to great victory a century ago. So, I'm about done. So, if you have any questions, we should wait for Gillian to come back. There we go.
How old is his son now?
Sorry?
How old is his son? Because he was there, wasn't he?
How old is Mr. Sparks?
He's 88.
88.
Wow.
Yeah,
That was
born in
amazing.
1936.
Yeah. Yeah, so he did come along,
Yeah.
and he's, I think he enjoyed himself. So yeah.
The Victoria Hotel, where was that, you know?
It was right next to, on London Road, there's the Academy Gate, sort of, not protective residence, so like social, it's not social housing. What's the word where you buy a flat and you're all looked after?
Was it near the old pulse shelter?
Warden assisted, thank
Near the
you.
old pulse building?
Yeah, so where the Frimley and Camberley District Council offices are, and then you've got the Warden assisted Academy Gate. It was literally just there, right next door.
Just past where the leisure centre is now, on the
Yeah,
A30 there.
yeah. Oh, did that exist until the 80s, their building? When it,
I remember it, it's not there. That's about right.
Probably, yeah, because the Academy Gate is probably 80s. There's a photograph downstairs
wow,
of
yeah.
It's next to the hotel, isn't it?
yeah. What's enduro? How does that come in?
Enduro, it encompasses bits of road and things like that as well. It's still essentially an off-road motorbike racing cross-country, but it
Right.
might cross roads and things as well.
Okay.
So it's very similar.
Any other questions? So, have you got any questions?
Why did they, because obviously Scramble was the original, why did we bow to the French with their motocross?
Well, that's a very good question. I don't know, maybe it was snazzier, just a snazzier name. I think also the governing body of the I forget whether it was the FIM or something like that, was controlled in France. So I think maybe they just picked up the French name because they were a French organisation.
Didn't the Americans pick up a motocross first?
Yeah.
I think we got it from the Americans.
Yeah, I think the French were the first ones to call it motocross. It was derived from the French.
Yeah.
So yeah.
I
But it
noticed,
spread worldwide really fast.
I noticed there were a couple of American machines on that list. There was the Harley Davidson
Yeah.
and the Henderson 1300, which was an inline four. That must have been a right handful over.
It was a beast of a thing, apparently.
Yeah, I
It
mean,
broke its drive shaft and retired.
Yeah.
It was a huge motorcycle.
Yeah.
Yeah. We had some monsters riding on Sunday. Triumph brought along a 1200cc road bike and put knobbly tyres on it, and all credit to them. They took it out onto the track and put it
I
round.
saw that, and
That's
some
probably
of them
like a-
KTM there as well.
Yeah, that's probably a £500 weight of motorbike.
Yeah.
So, yeah, it took us a few tree stumps out for us.
That Rudge was quite impressive. The 4-valve Rudge someone.
So yeah, yeah. That was a 1926 motorcycle, so that was showing that
Yeah.
what you could do with a near century-old motorcycle.
It was
So,
a very good event.
yeah, thank you.
Was it after the last war? Was it called the Corgi, the one that they dropped down with the paratroops?
Yeah, that was the Second World War. Those folding bikes that went into a car.
They were being sold all over the place after the war.
Yeah.
It was nice to actually see Johnny Sparks there as well.
Yeah. No, yeah.
Bless him.
No, Ian and lots of people have been sort of trying to get him out to come along,
Yeah.
and eventually some of his family brought him along, just so he could see what was going on. I think he quite enjoyed it. I know Ian was chatting to him, so.
And so the so we have items on display from the 365 Club, and that's a time when British motorbikes, manufactured bikes, are sort of the top of the range, and then it's
Yeah.
post 65 you start to get other bikes from different
Yeah.
countries being better
Yeah.
models than the
Yeah.
pre-65.
Yeah, it's kind of an arbitrary cut-off, I think, 65, but the British industry is still in full flight and growth into the 60s. And then they rest on their laurels a bit, and they don't address some of the concerns people have about reliability and leaking oil and poor brakes. And then the Japanese come along and start producing machines that are like sewing machines, and they're reliable and they don't leak oil, and they're different. And people go, well, that's better. I'll have one of those that's reliable.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. Well, has anybody got any questions?
Okay.